Hello, I'm Sarah Barth, and it is my joy and honor to serve as the Executive Director of Sempervirens Fund. Thank you for joining us in another of our monthly Under the Redwoods webinar series, in which we explore the beauty, the history, the science, the inspiration of redwood forests and all the various creatures and other living things that occupy those forests. Thank you to Scharf Investments. They have been the supporter of this webinar series. We greatly appreciate their support and want to recognize that. I'm so excited that we're having a conversation with you today about policy, public policy, its role in conservation, and how advocacy on behalf of the environment can make a big difference. And so our speaker today, who's going to talk to you all about this, is a relatively new staff member here at Sempervirens Fund. Rachel Dann is our new Director of Government Relations. We created this position in part because we understood that increasingly the way we're going to protect redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains and ensure their long-term viability is through the use of public policy tools. And if you live in Santa Cruz County and have interfaced with public policy in any way, you almost certainly have experienced Rachel. She has an incredible depth of experience in this realm, working for many different elected officials at different levels of government, advising them on environmental issues and far beyond that. She sits on her local planning commission, so she's got literally a courtside view of many of the kinds of land use decisions that are made. Yeah, so she is a phenom in the public policy realm, and we were absolutely fortunate to have her join our team. I'll let her tell you more about herself directly. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Rachel Dann, our Director of Government Relations. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm just going to start the presentation. I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to be able to talk to you all today about something I'm passionate about, which is public policy and advocacy. So let's get to it. What are we going to cover in this discussion today? So I broke this up into 3 parts, and I'm going to start with talking about the origins of Sempervirens Fund and the policy work that Sempervirens has done in the past. And the middle section, I'm going to talk about what we're working on right now, currently. And then I'm going to end by talking about how we do advocacy, but then also how you can engage in some of the work that we're doing, and also how you can apply these tools to any kind of advocacy that you might be interested in engaging in your community. And then at the end, we will have some time for some Q&A. So please save those questions for the end. I really enjoy answering questions and feel like it's the best way that I can help you understand what we do here and what I do. Okay, a little about me. I grew up in San Francisco. I did my undergrad at UC Berkeley, so I stayed in the Bay Area. And then I actually started a PhD program in history at UCSC. But I left that program out with my master's because I really found my passion in public service. And what I didn't put on this slide was in high school, actually, I interned for Nancy Pelosi. And when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do outside of academia, I thought about that experience, and I sought out my local member of Congress, Sam Farr, and that just started me on what became a great career for me in public service. So I'm very grateful that I was able to find a passion that worked for me professionally. Okay, so getting to the origins of Sempervirens, in doing research for this presentation, and what really struck me was that the Sempervirens Club, as it was known in the very beginning, was really born from activism. and that the folks that started our organization were inspired to act based on what was going on around them. And they were just a grassroots group of folks who were able to make great change, inspired by what was happening going on around them. So we're going to set a little bit of historical context so we can understand that Sempervirens Club didn't just come out of nowhere, that it was part of a larger conservation movement that was going on at the time in this country. And so, as the slide states, 1900 was a time of heightened awareness for conservation, I think probably as a lot of us know, and a growing appreciation for nature among those that were living in our growing cities. And this was partly as a result of the massive amount of changes that were going on in this country and in other places in the world as a result of the Industrial Revolution, transportation expansion, resource extractions, and population growth that was occurring from immigration to this country from all parts of the world. And so I think it's really one of those things when I studied this as as a PhD student, the changes that were going on from about 1830 up until 1900 are really hard for us in modern times to understand the scale of the change. It was just a time of enormous change, not just in nature about what you could see going around you, but it was a change in how people worked, where they worked. So sometimes when there's periods of massive changes, it inspires action. And so that was the historical setting for the growth of the conservation movement at the time Sempervirens was founded. And as the last bullet point notes, this was also a time of deep inequities in this country, racism. This was the time of Jim Crow, and of course, ongoing forced removal of indigenous peoples from their lands. So getting back to Sempervirens, Sempervirens Club was established because folks were inspired to act on what was going around them. And what was going around them in the Santa Cruz Mountains was old growth redwoods were being taken out at a rapid rate and really changing the looks even of the Santa Cruz Mountains, something you could see with your own eyes. And in addition to clear cutting and taking out old growth redwoods, there was also active mining going on in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which also was changing the landscape quite a bit. There's a lot of limestone up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and limestone is a key component in the making of cement. So the birth of Sempervirens in the resulting establishment of California's first state park is really what I say here, a textbook grassroots activism. These were, like I said, at first at least, a relatively small group of folks. They saw what was going on around them. They called their friends. They had a meeting. They literally passed a hat around. Collected, I think it was $32, which in today's funds is about $1,200. And then they used their networks, and there were some influential folks, to lobby and petition their state legislators to protect the big trees in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And what is truly extraordinary is that within 3 years of their very first meeting, the legislation was passed establishing Big Basin State Park. So that things moved quickly. But I think the point is that this was also because this wasn't out of nowhere. This was a time of awareness for conservation, and so they were striking at a good time to get the attention of the state legislature. And so when we talk about the past, I believe that it's always important to note that not all were welcome in the early conservation movement. Black, Indigenous, and minority voices weren't a part of Sempervirens Fund's early efforts. And this is despite the fact that there were many Black, Indigenous, and other minority conservationists working at the time and doing this work. And I just wanted to take one moment to highlight one such person that I learned about in my own research doing in preparing for this presentation, and that is Charles Young. And I'm highlighting him because he had an extraordinary life, and he was the first Black National Park superintendent and was the third African-American graduate of West Point Academy. And this was at the time when the National Park Service was very young, and actually the military was assigned to be rangers. And so that is how Mr. Young became the first parks superintendent, first Black National Park superintendent, because he was assigned to Sequoia National Park. I think it was in around, oh yeah, here's the date here when he, I included this quote here. I thought it was a beautiful quote. You can read for yourself. But he was stationed there in 1903. And at the end of that summer, he wrote a letter to the Department of the Interior suggesting to the department that the US government begin purchasing private lands around the park in order to grow the park and be accessible to the public. So I just thought that was marvelous that he had the idea of basically what land trusts do today. So thank you for letting me highlight the contributions of Mr. Young. So as the decades went on, Sempervirens is a very old organization, so he's talking decades. This organization responded to the new and emerging threats to the redwood forests. And after World War II, those were largely threats to development, the parcelization of the Redwood Mountains, Santa Cruz Mountains, excuse me, and the building and development boom of the 60s and 70s, which then gave rise to what is maybe not, I'm calling it the modern environmental movement, but I guess since CEQA was, I think, established in the 70s, it's not so modern anymore. But the California Environmental Quality Act was legislation that was introduced and passed in this era, as well as the California Coastal Commission was established in this era as well. So to wrap up this section, I think we can establish that throughout the history of Sempervirens, this organization has cultivated relationships and engaged with elected officials and decision makers to assist us in developing tools to help us carry out our mission of protecting forests. So now that we've discussed the history of advocacy at our organization, the question is, where do we go from here? And I think the answer is that we continue our advocacy to meet the challenges of today to ensure healthy forests ongoing into the future. And I think we can all agree our biggest threat is that from climate change, catastrophic fire, intense and frequent storm events, and drought, development, and then also ensuring that our local, federal, and state laws are meeting the needs of the modern conservation goals today. And I wanted to note that for this slide, the photo on this slide is taken on August 24th, 2020. It is on a north-facing slope off Felton Empire Road in Santa Cruz County, if you know the area. And this was just a few days after, well, it was obviously the CZU fire in this photo is still burning, but it was a good 6 days after the major growth of that fire, which occurred on the evening of August 18th. But this is a north-facing slope that was very moist, yet it was still on fire. And the firefighters who I was riding with just kept telling me that whole day we were going around looking at the damage, that they had never seen anything like this before. And so I wanted to include this photo just to highlight some of our modern challenges today with climate change. So what are we working on now to address these modern threats? Well, currently right now, and I'm going to go into greater detail in just a few minutes on all three of these issues. But just really quickly, we're working to advocate for a climate bond at the state. We are working very deeply in a local measure in Santa Cruz County to provide funding for nature-based solutions to climate change. And then, as Sarah noted, we also have a bill in the state legislature that we are working on. But moving forward, let's talk a little bit about how advocacy works and how we get it done. Sometimes I think what government relations professionals, lobbyists, advocates, however you want to characterize it, it's kind of a nebulous area. What is it that they do and how do they get it done? And there are a lot of ways to characterize this work. And, I have 3 pillars up here that I'm going to talk about, but this is not an exhaustive discussion or list by any means. But those 3 pillars are relationships, developing relationships, coalitions, and having individual supporter networks. So I'm going to talk about all 3 of them and their importance in advocacy work. So number 1, relationships. I think, any government relations professional and lobbyist will agree that having strong relationships with decision makers and with stakeholders in the community is the most important part of advocacy. And that in order really to get any legislation passed, funding for project areas, sometimes just to get a meeting, it's really important to have already developed some key relationships. And Sempervirens, this organization has been really successful with this in the past, and with legislation, budget requests, grants, because staff has spent time cultivating those relationships. And I could just speak to my own personal experience of 16 years in the 3rd District Supervisor's Office in Santa Cruz County. I knew each and every executive director of Sempervirens during that time because this organization has been so effective at making sure that the key decision makers in this region understand the projects that Sempervirens is working on, and also how those decision makers can help support those projects. So I can attest from both sides of the table the success of this organization in developing relationships. It's also really important to be a part of a coalition if you want to get something done. We can't do it alone. And so we partner with other like-minded organizations to leverage our voice. Who do we partner with? We partner with our sister organization, Save the Redwoods League, the State Parks Foundation. Of course, State Parks has been a historic partnership with Sempervirens, obviously. Peninsula Open Space Trust, the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County, I apologize for the acronyms there, and the Amamutsan Tribal Band, and many, many more. And then we also leverage our voice by joining organizations that pool conservationists together to develop a shared strategy around conservation so that we then can go and leverage that voice with our statewide and other decision makers. And so Together Bay Area is one such organization, the California Council of Land Trusts, which advocate for land trusts, and then the national organization, the Land Trust Alliance. And then lastly, grassroots advocacy. As Sarah was outlining in her intro, those advocacy actions are so important. We cannot do it without you. So we call on our supporter networks to help us advocate for legislation and funding that supports our mission. And your voice is critically important in helping to move that needle. Decision makers, they need to hear from you. They want to hear from you even. And this last bullet point, may seem a little corny, but I've included it because I just strongly believe that it's true that individuals working together can create change. I've seen it happen so many times, especially in local government. And so working together in an organized fashion can be very effective. So what are some specific actions individuals can take to leverage their voice, to be a good grassroots supporter? So the first one's obvious, always vote and remind others. And I'm sure everyone listening here votes every time, but I am also sure that we know somebody who doesn't. I know I do, and I hound them all the time. Also, join organizations that can leverage your voice. Maybe you're a supporter of Sempervirens. If so, you've made an excellent choice. But there's lots of organizations that can do the same thing, and you can join more than one. And then the third bullet point here is maybe the most important, is to meet your elected representatives at each level, local, state, county, federal, and develop relationships with them. And this may seem a little scary, and you might say, well, how do I really do that? And do they want to hear from me? There's a lot of ways you can do that. And, you know, most elected officials have public events, they have town hall meetings, office hours, some may have fundraisers. And so go to those events. Sometimes elected officials have office hours and nobody shows up. That happens actually quite frequently. So they want to hear from you. And if you do get a chance to meet them and they are conservation champions, thank them. If climate and conservation are your top priorities, let them know. It's important to let them know what your priorities are. And, you know, say you don't live in coastal California, or maybe you live in another state and you don't have what you would consider to be climate-friendly representatives. I say here, don't despair, because you have the biggest opportunity to make the most difference. And one of the great things about conservation policy, in my view, is that it's bipartisan. And we all know that it's been framed in a very partisan manner in the last 10, 20 years. But in reality, it's a bipartisan issue. And so you would have the opportunity to frame this issue in that manner and to help move the needle there in an effective and consequential way. So what can we do to get involved now? So right now, one of the most important things going on at the state level is that our state legislators are right now in the process of deciding whether or not to put a climate bond in front of voters in November. And there are working groups in both chambers of the state, in the Assembly and in the Senate. And they are trying to do two things right now. One, they're trying to figure out if they're going to put a climate bond on the state ballot. And the second thing they're deciding is what's going to be in it. So right now, it's a great time to call your state and your state legislators, your member of the Assembly and your state Senate, your member of the state Senate, and let them know that you want a climate bond on the November ballot. And if there are specific parts of that bond or the issue that are important to you, for instance, maybe state parks is really important to you, or land acquisition to preserve redwood forests, let them know, because they're going to have to make choices about how much funding to give each of these issues. And, you know, I include the second bullet point on here is a real critical one, because the resource agencies frankly are out of money right now. Just this morning, I saw another article about how the Department of Finance has told departments and critical departments that our organization relies on, such as the Wildlife Conservation Board and the Coastal Conservancy, that any unspent funding from their agencies could be clawed back. So we're at a critical moment right now, and your voice can make a difference. Another important issue we're working on that will also be in front of voters if you live in Santa Cruz County is the Santa Cruz County Water and Wildfire Protection Act. This is a local measure, like I mentioned, that will go in front of all voters in Santa Cruz County. And it is a parcel tax to fund clean water, wildfire resiliency projects, clean beaches, coastal resiliency, and much more. I believe we have a link in our chat where you can read the measure and learn more about it. But here's some real quick bullet points up here to tell you a little bit about what it is. It will raise $7.5 million countywide. All of those dollars will stay right here in Santa Cruz County for local projects. And another really important part of this proposed measure is that the folks don't often think about, but it's so important, is that having a local source of funding can help us at the local level leverage dollars from the state and federal government. Oftentimes you'll have a big federal grant, but you'll need to provide, a percentage local match. And if you don't have that local match, then you just can't take advantage of the grant. And so another thing that this local measure does is provides that possibility of having that local match, so we can draw down much bigger grants to execute some big projects that we need in Santa Cruz County. And then lastly, we're one of the only Bay Area counties without a dedicated source of funding for nature. All right, and then lastly, and Sarah mentioned this in her intro, we have a bill that's being carried by Assemblymember Gail Pellerin, who represents parts of Santa Cruz County and parts of Santa Clara County. And this bill is Assembly Bill 2103. And like Sarah mentioned, it creates a pilot program in the Santa Cruz Mountains in the CZU burn scar area, specifically to help to facilitate land transfers to state parks, and for the purpose of reopening Big Basin State Parks. And this recently passed out of committee. And when it is scheduled for a floor vote, we will most certainly call on all of you, if you so choose, to help support us in this. And so this concludes the presentation part of this under my part of Under the Redwoods. And so now I think we want to throw it over to some Q&A with Sarah and me. And Sarah, who also has an extensive background in policy as well. And so I think you've got two folks here who can really help you understand what advocacy is, or just answer any question that you might have about this. So I'll stop sharing my screen and we can go to the Q&A.
Thanks, Rachel. And one just observation, we talked a lot on this webinar, but also in our outreach to our supporters about conservation funding, public funding for conservation at the state level, at the federal level. That's often an area that Sempervirens and other sister organizations interface with their supporters on. And I just want to expand a little bit on that to make sure people really understand what that means. Those dollars, those conservation dollars that we are seeking at the state level and federally and locally, in some cases they go directly to various public agencies that use them to do actual projects on the ground. Oftentimes those funds are used to support grants that are competitive, that groups like Sempervirens can apply for and can then use directly on the ground. And so it's not at all unusual for us in our land acquisition work, in our major restoration and stewardship projects on the ground, to get public funding through public grants, to support things like removing a dam on Mill Creek, or doing a large wildfire fuel reduction project on our properties and surrounding properties. In fact, we just were part of an effort to get some funding out of the state's CAL FIRE agency that was a public funding grant. And so those dollars, when we ask you as a supporter to say endorse or call your legislator about getting a climate bond on the ballot, it means all kinds of good things for the environment, including at times, couple clicks down the road, support for the work that we do. And not just us, many nonprofits doing excellent conservation work. So
Yeah.
I just think it's not always obvious to people how a climate bond translates into something on the ground if you care about redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains.
No, exactly. Yeah, that's a really important clarification. Yeah.
So turning to some questions, Rachel, you have been, I've spent most of my career working on public policy as a outside of government person, although I did spend a few years on Capitol Hill. But you've done the opposite and spent the majority of your career thus far working on the inside, working for elected officials or government agencies. And I'm curious what inspired you to make the shift to when you joined Sempervirens to be an advocate on the outside. I'm sure you were an advocate on the inside as well. But what inspired you to make that transition to working on public policy from this perch rather than your prior governmental role?
Well, I mean, I think, sometimes the answers to these questions are just kind of basic. Like in my case, the opportunity came up. And I guess based on my previous experience working with Sempervirens and working with you on the Mill Creek Dam removal, gave me a little window into the work you do. And, sometimes it's just there's an opportunity and you go for it. And I think though that it's it would be honest of me to say that I'm not sure that if it was another organization that I would have gone for it, but I think it was partly because I worked with Sempervirens and respected the work that was being done. That was the inspiration for me to make that change, frankly.
Well, which was exactly one of the reasons we were keen to hire you. Um, I'm curious, having been on both sides, and now that you're with us and advising us, what do you think are some of the biggest mistakes or missed opportunities that folks who are advocates for the environment have made in trying to influence the public process?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because, I hesitate to point out anybody's mistakes. The hindsight's always 2020 when you look back, and I make mistakes regularly. I think there's a lot of ways you could go with that question. It's hard to say in general because I think sometimes advocacy can be so specific based on the decision makers you're working with and the issue. So I think, in my experience, folks that don't establish a basis of trust before kind of bringing an issue to an elected officials can make the road harder as you move on. And I think that's why I emphasize relationships so much, because if you do that work on the front end, it can ease the path when you really need the help of your elected official and develop that support to the point where they want to help you, to the point where they ask you, what is it I can help you with these days? That's where you want to get, I think.
Yeah. Well, and to that end, I've been thinking a lot about advocacy because there's been so much in the news with people advocating very vociferously in a very conflict-laden way about a variety of, national issues, international issues. And it might be helpful to hear from you, there are different types of advocacy, and Sempervirens engages in some types and not in others. Anyway, I wonder if you just reflect on that a little bit and talk about what you've seen us do and what we don't do in terms of that kind of advocacy work. And I fear sometimes that our audience may hear the word advocacy and think we're engaging in far more conflict-laden activities than we actually do.
Yeah, this is a great question, because there are all sorts of flavors of advocacy, and in many cases, they're all necessary to employ at certain times to move the needle. The type of activism that my parents engaged in the 60s, and that we're seeing on campuses right now, that's a form of activism that's appropriate for those folks using that form of advocacy. For me, working for Sempervirens, obviously that would not be appropriate. I'm not going to do good work for Sempervirens by chaining myself to Assemblymember Pellerin's desk and demanding that she take action. It just wouldn't translate. The way that I would do advocacy on behalf of Sempervirens is very different than a student group advocating for an issue would do. And one time, about 20 years ago, I was actually talking with John Laird, who's now our state senator in Santa Cruz County, about this and about just the different types of activism and how he, as a legislator, needs all flavors. For him to do his job, he needs his staff who are advocates. He needs outside organizations like Sempervirens who perform advocacy in the way that we do. And then sometimes you need that other flavor of activism that uses tools that are a little bit more confrontational and demanding. And in our country's history, all those types of tools of advocacy have been used and, have contributed to moving the needle on various issues. But
Yeah.
I don't know, what do you think about that?
I think I agree with that. And I think our approach over time organizationally in some ways has stayed very much the same and in some ways has changed. And I'll give you two examples. You alluded to the fact that from our earliest days over almost 125 years ago, we were advocating for the state government to set aside funding to buy land that became Big Basin. And we just finished telling this audience why we want them to advocate for the legislature to put a bond measure on the ballot that would allocate, millions and millions of dollars annually to conservation so we can acquire and protect redwood forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So in some ways, our policy and advocacy approaches have not changed at all. In other ways, I think our history, for instance, of interacting with the timber industry in our region began as one of direct conflict, very conflict laden, that led to various policy measures that severely limited what could be done in this region in terms of logging. And that was a very loggerhead, in your face, I don't know that it was in your face advocacy, but the way we were operating was at direct odds with this other stakeholder in the region. And today we have a very different dynamic in which we are understand that the timber industry owns and manages lands that, while they manage them for goals that are very different than what Sempervirens manages its lands for, these remain critical open space lands that provide important habitat to species like mountain lions that continue to function as natural forests, even though they're logged on a rotation cycle. And that we have much more in some ways in common with the timber industry than not. And so we engage in much more active dialogue and direct collaboration with them on both managing specific properties as well as thinking about what the future of our region should look like. And we hope to continue and head in that direction even more so. And that is a very different kind of engagement with public policy, one in which we're trying to bring together diverse stakeholders to come up with a shared vision that we can then bring to government leaders. And I don't mean to suggest we're 100% there yet, but it's such a different approach than we've taken in the past. And I am hopeful that it
Mhm.
will be effective.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good example.
Um, how do you think, how do you think we need to be engaging with stakeholders, and who else besides the timber industry do you see as important voices that Sempervirens either does or needs to be working with to shape public policy in our region and in our state?
Well, I mean, I think, we work with these folks already, but I think that going forward, because of climate change and the effects of climate change, um, we will have to develop even closer relationships with local governments who oversee land use and planning.
Mhm.
And things like uh, in the paper this weekend, there was an article about Charlie Road up in the Santa Cruz Mountains that was destroyed in last year's storms, and the county just tapped out of funding, and it doesn't have a plan to fund and repair that road. And, trying to partner with local government to see if there are solutions that organizations like Sempervirens Fund or other
Yeah.
conservation organizations can partner to help try to solve these problems. I think that areas like ours, where we work, where there's extensive development that exists in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and trying to figure out how we're going to go forward in the future to support these communities in the face of climate change.
Yeah, and increasingly, as you're alluding to, stewardship of these landscapes is going to be a big part of ensuring their viability, managing these forests to reduce the risk of wildfire, managing these forests in ways that help reduce the likelihood of flooding and mitigate the impacts of drought, which is good for the forest and good for the adjacent communities.
Yeah.
Not that we didn't, I mean, we've always been a presence and tried to work collaboratively with landowners in the region. We are a neighbor to many of these landowners, but going forward, I think a big part of our policy efforts and our advocacy work is going to need to be linked arm in arm with these landowners so that we are jointly presenting ideas about how we address the shared goals of reducing wildfire risk, minimizing the impacts of drought, minimizing and reducing the impacts of flooding, etc. I do see that as the future for Sempervirens, understanding that green infrastructure and helping those communities and landowners understand it. So we are working together to accomplish those goals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
One last question from me, and then I'm going to turn it over to Matt to see what kind of questions we may have gotten from the audience. You and I were chatting about this a little before the talk. How has advocacy changed in the 21st century?
Yeah, yeah, you brought that up, and I realized I didn't talk at all about social media in my presentation, which has really been a game changer with advocacy. There are some great things about it. You can contact your elected officials easily. You can follow what they're doing. There's so many positives. There's also negatives. And it's not always really the best way to do advocacy, in my opinion, on an individual basis. But it's really, social media has really just been, in my view, the game changer. And well, I don't know, how do you see this?
Totally. I completely agree with you. I think I know, just speaking for Sempervirens, that it has the audience we reach now with a single social media post is so much larger than we ever could have historically reached. And when you're able to not only reach those people, but inspire them to action around something very specific, a particular issue they can weigh in on, it's very powerful. We mentioned that this month we've had 6,000 action
Right.
items taken by supporters of ours. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
But it also means that every other interest group is also leveraging social media. So
Right.
for our 6,000 actions, there's probably many other stakeholders similarly ginning up that kind of support. So in some ways, it is a game changer, and in other ways, it's still a matter of competing with various stakeholders for the time and attention and support of government agencies and elected officials who are listening to those audiences for all the many things that they're being asked to do. But I remain so hopeful, partly because I think there is deep love, affection, respect, valuing of Redwoods, both locally and frankly internationally. It's not hard for me to advocate, and I'm sure not for you either, to advocate for Redwoods. People get it instantly that these trees are really important and that there's something fundamentally wrong about, killing a species that lives 1,500 years or more.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and as I said, I think increasingly there's an understanding locally and beyond of the fact that the future of these forests is not just some nice to have thing and oh, they're inspiring. I think people fundamentally are starting to understand, and we are telling that story, that the future of these forests is the future of the communities in this region, that you cannot separate them no matter how much we think we can. And that therefore, if you care about your neighbors, if you care about your community, you're going to care about the surrounding wildlands, whatever they may be in your respective region. To me, that is a game changer, and gives me great hope that societally we will continue to get better about protecting wild spaces. So on that note, and I think public policy is such a powerful tool. I just want to say one more thing before I invite Matt on to share audience questions, and that is, my earliest days in my career were as a lobbyist for various national conservation organizations, advocating, lobbying on behalf of legislation to protect endangered species. And I think sometimes people imagine that it's like politics is a dirty business and lobbyists are bad people and advocacy is distasteful. And I just want to challenge that notion and encourage everyone on this call, on this Zoom, if these are things you care about, lift your voice and use it. Because if you don't, others will, and they may not be advocating for the things you care about. So that's my plug for everyone, advocates
Here, here.
for nature. So with that, Matt, tell us what kinds of questions we may have from the audience.
Yes, thank you. What a terrific conversation. And we, of course, have gotten a lot of great questions from our community. There's some fundamental questions about what are some specific and practical advice you might give, Rachel, for contacting representatives. What to say, what to make sure you say, key words to use. What matters when we call our representatives?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, it kind of depends on what you're calling them for, but if you're calling your representative, for instance, to advocate for the climate bond, you'll want to make sure you give them your name and address. I mean, I know that sounds basic, but it's really important because they're going to want to know if you're their constituent. And if you're not their constituent, they might just throw your comment in the garbage. Because they've got enough of their own constituents. So make sure you call your own representative, first of all. And then you want to be just succinct about what you say. I'm calling Representative Smith to urge them to support a climate bond. I care about the climate bond because of XYZ, support for state parks. I want to protect redwoods. I want to support habitat for mountain lions or whatever it is. And just be succinct and clear. You could also, this is an opportunity to say, is Representative Smith having office hours anytime? Is there a public event where I could meet them? And that's where you could possibly find a place where you can meet them one-on-one. And when you meet them one-on-one, sometimes, it could be scary to meet a new person, but I guarantee you they want to meet you. They want to meet you. They want to hear what you have to say. And so they're just people like anybody else. And, you just tell them who you are, what's important to you. And then, I also do think if you do happen to know something that they did that you do support, let them know. They'll remember that and they'll remember you better for that as well.
And you
I don't know,
don't have to
Sarah.
be You don't have to be an expert on these issues. You don't have to be able to counter any argument that they make to you.
Exactly.
Their job is to represent their constituents and to hear from their constituents. So your job is just to tell them what you care about, what you're asking them to do. You do not need to debate them about these issues. That's not, and most elected officials are not going to debate you. They're going to hear and be respectful, even if they don't agree with you.
Thank you very much. That's really great advice. We had some questions about, well, you talked about three of our priorities, and we had some questions about whether we are tracking anything on the federal level in terms of policy that might support our work, or in the agency space within the state of California, like coastal resource agencies that are increasingly funding projects that connect marine resources with redwood habitats, for example.
We are tracking our agency partners pretty closely just because of the dire financial situation that they're in right now. So mostly right now we're tracking them in terms of watching their funding being threatened to be clawed back. But I think that that's a good question. And as far as, I mean, I liked what the question was implying about supporting grants that go from the redwoods to the sea because the marine environment and the redwood forests are so connected. And then at the federal level, right now, most of our work right now is, we're working on state issues in the realm of state decision makers. But Sarah and I have talked about some ways that we could think about, getting some tools to do our work with federal legislation. So yeah, we are thinking about that, but there's nothing specifically we're working on right now.
But there are some local measures, some ordinances, and some state level issues that we've tracked and engaged with, ranging from a proposal in Santa Cruz County to allow low-cost camping sites to pop up all over the Santa Cruz Mountains, which we had some suggestions and concerns about, to efforts at the agency level to look at things like the governor's wildfire resilience plan that's being implemented throughout the state. Or another example is state parks as an agency has been going through a strategic planning process for the state agency and for the state park system that we've weighed in on and are tracking very closely. So we engage at a number of different levels. Most of it has been state and local, state and regional. At times it's been more active in the federal arena. For example, we were deeply involved as an organization in the creation of the Chitoni Coast Areas National Monument. That was an addition, that's a protected status, federal land, and that decision was one made by President Obama, who issued the proclamation to protect that area, which was definitely a federal effort. So really our engagement, local, state, federal, we haven't done international to my knowledge, but has really varied depending upon what the needs are and what the particular lands or resources are that we're trying to protect at the moment. And with Rachel on board, I think we are in the process of trying to design a more comprehensive body of policy work that we can have this audience help engage with.
Thank you. I know we're at 2:00, but I'd be
Yes.
remiss if I didn't ask a question about how we are viewing Indigenous communities and our intersection with them and with policy, particularly with programs like land that might include land back.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Do you want to go ahead?
No,
Sarah, you
go
can
for
take
it,
that.
Rachel.
I was just going to say those partnerships are incredibly important to us. And I worked with Amamutsan Tribal Band and Chairman Val Lopez closely when I worked in the 3rd District Supervisor's Office. And it's wonderful to be able to work with them here. So we do engage with them frequently. We solicit their counsel. We do a lot of listening. We try to operate on their timeline, not ours. And we partner with them and have in the past. And I mean, Sarah, maybe you want to talk about how we've more specifically partnered with them.
Yeah, well, as Rachel said, often we seek their input and advice on particular policy matters. If it's not on their radar screen, we will bring issues to their attention and see if there are things they think they want to engage in. Conversely, if they have public policy issues that they're involved with, they will at times come and ask for our support. It's very much a respectful two-way relationship. And there have been times where one of the things that we've done as a Sempervirens, because of its longevity and deep ties with many of the elected officials and government agencies, has at times been a door opener for tribes to get them into the conversation. These days, the tribes that we work with most closely, that was sort of then, and now I think they're as in the conversation as we are, and that door opening doesn't have to happen because it's not needed. But early on, that was a key role that we've played, and it's one that we are keen to play for other stakeholders and ally groups who may not have a 120-year history to draw upon, but who deserve a seat at the table. And so that is something we've been really happy to do, and I think it's been effective. So I think with that, I'm mindful of the time. I want to thank Rachel for joining us and joining not only the webinar, but joining Sempervirens. I want to thank our audience for joining us and just encourage you to stay attuned to what we're doing on the policy front. And if you have ideas, if there are people in the audience who have things you want us to be paying attention to, please reach out to us directly. This webinar will be available on our website within the next day or two. If you missed some of it, or you just were so inspired, you want to share it with others. And finally, I want to mention we have for our May webinar, we're heading in a different direction yet again with author Daniel Lewis. He's been all over. I've seen him in all different locations these days because he's just published a book called 12 Trees, which is really fascinating, in which he explores nature and survival as seen via a dozen different species of trees, including redwoods. So that should be a really great webinar. And maybe in that context, we can talk to him about how public policy can ensure those dozen different tree species are preserved. Thank you again to Sharf Investments for funding and hosting the webinar series. We are so grateful to them for their support. And we look forward to seeing you all soon next month under the Redwoods.